Welcome, friends, everybody, to our pilot and first program of Neil on Africa today. And with us, we have an unbelievable great South African, a patriot, Graham Power. Graham, welcome.
Thank you.
Today, Graham is the chairman of Power Group, the founder member of Unashamedly Ethical, and many other organizations that he's a leadership in this country. Graham, welcome, and absolute pleasure having you on Neil on Africa.
Thanks, Neil, and a privilege to be on this session with you, knowing that it's number one, and so hopefully we'll not be too boring out there.
I hope not. And it's very casual, so thank you very much also for inviting us to your home. Graham, I think let's really get into it, and first and foremostly, I'd like to know from you, what do you think makes you an African?
First of all, both my parents, great-grandparents, etc. are all born in Africa. So I'm on the one side a fifth generation, the other side a fourth generation. So I certainly see myself as very African. I may be white, but I'm an African, and I'm proud to be an African. And I have a heart for this continent. I certainly have a heart for South Africa, and very proud to be a Cape Townian, born and bred.
That's very good to know. Graham, the word Graham Power, the name Graham Power, specifically in our country, is synonymous with religion. It is when you say Graham Power, there's a lot of things that come up, but one of them very strongly is the conscientious ideology of religion and faith. How would you today say that in your life, being a fundamental Christian and a person that believes in good, is there a way that there is still a place in business today, in modern business, for faith and religion?
My answer to that is absolutely. First of all, I've had the privilege of being in conferences and gatherings with Africa leaders. Again, last week we had 50 leaders together. And around Africa, in fact around the world, when you ask people, what are the greatest challenge facing your nation? What is the greatest challenge facing your continent? I want to say to you, absolutely, without any doubt, the top two that come out all the time is leadership and corruption.
Right.
Now comes the question, when we talk about leadership, it's, in my view, our biggest challenge is about role models and mentors. So I'm of the view that we need to be able to show that you can be a business person, whether you're Christian or whatever faith, that's not the important thing, with strong ethical values. Mine happens to be Christian. The next guy may happen to be a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever. Man, as long as our values are solid, then we are a good role model for those around us, to our family, first of all, our kids, our grandkids, our neighbors, etc. And somebody once gave me a book which said Ethics in the Workplace. And in the middle of the book, they had what they call an ethics checklist. Now, in business, you will know, often we talk about the grey area,
Yes.
especially when it comes to paying taxes. This book said there are 3 key points. Number 1, is it legal? Yes or no? That's quite easy. Number 2, is it balanced? Is this deal we're doing, is it a win-win deal? In other words, that there's no one that's screwing the other one. Then the third one, to me, removes the greyness out of any decision or call that I make. How will it make me feel if it were published in the media?
Right.
And how will it make me feel if my wife and my kids or my family knew about this?
And what I'm taking from that in your answer is that it's actually also about checking your conscience.
Absolutely.
And that's the barometer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that you have spearheaded in your lifetime, and a lot of it specifically is based on ethics, on values and principles which we know you for. The question I'd like to ask you now is, within your own business and what you do every single day, how do you lead a company and ensuring that in your business there is still the principle of being ethical and also having values?
I could chase after more and more companies, and at one stage I had 12 companies and was running after the one goal to the next. And I came to realize that no matter how I filled my life with more and more material things, whether that be new farms or new boats,
Sure.
or new 4x4s or an aeroplane and all of these things, there still wasn't this inner peace. And it was only just over 20 years ago, I was in my early 40s, and I ended up making a serious spiritual commitment. And so it's been an interesting walk.
Would you say, Graham, that leading from that, your humble beginnings, the understanding of where you've come from, would you say that you took some of those values and ethics back into your business?
I always used to see myself as an ethical person and never paid bribes and those kind of things. But I want to tell you, I got caught up in the, let's call it in the mafia, or in this circle of the construction industry. And I remember at a strategic planning session, which we had as a company, we had it in Stellenbosch. We ended up asking Professor Willie Estreisen from Stellenbosch University, professor, to come along and to give us a talk. And the topic that day happened to be ethics, and he ended up really challenging me. I went back home that night. It was a Friday evening, and I want to tell you, I couldn't sleep because I cleaned up a lot of my personal stuff, but we were still involved with the industry, with this price fixing, colluding,
Sure.
covering each other, prices and so forth. The next morning, I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I went in, and he quoted a particular scripture out of the Bible, Proverbs 11 verse 1, which says, "The Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight."
Wow.
Okay, so now I go there and I open up, this is now 3 o'clock in the morning, and I open it up and I start reading from Proverbs 11 through to about Proverbs 20. There's like about 8 places where it talks about, various kind of corruption stuff and so on. Proverbs 20, I think it's verse 17 or 18, says, "Food gained by fraud tastes sweet to a man, but he ends up with a mouthful of gravel."
Wow.
Now, I'm a putmarker. I'm building roads. I know what gravel looks like. Well, I've never eaten it. But
Sure.
Here's a message loud and clear to me. Food gained by fraud tastes sweet to a man, but he ends up with a mouthful of gravel. And I want to tell you, I went into the day 2 of our strategy session. I just said, "Hey guys, there's one thing we're still doing, which is not on." And it was one of the toughest things I've ever done in my life. 10 years later, Soccer World Cup, all the stadiums, all the infrastructure, the industry is going wild. It's busy. From 2005, 6, 7, 8 was the busiest time that I've seen in my working life. And I suspected that the companies were continuing because you could see just the differentiation in prices and things like that. And we just stood firm. And thank God for that, because come 2011, front page of the newspaper, construction industry, collusion.
Sure.
Front page, and there were 15 companies' names,
Sure.
and our name was not there, which otherwise it would have been. That day I sent a note to all of our staff, and I said, "Today I thank God, because it's through his prompting that we are not embarrassed, fined, and part of the scenario today."
Sure. Graham, the big discussion and the big debate in South Africa is now the elections that have been passed. In many other countries, Malawi, they've just had elections. We've had a election in Zimbabwe a year ago. There's a lot of elections happening on this continent of ours, and there's a big debate about leadership. Ongoingly, people are speaking about leadership on the continent of Africa. What is your feeling about leadership?
Neil, we've seen what 9 years of poor leadership has done in South Africa. It has virtually bankrupted this country. State capture, too much power, and someone that has become, in a way, a dictator. And we've seen that elsewhere in Africa. So our 2-term system for our leader, our president, I think is wise. It comes from the Western culture has got that, and I think it ensures that no one person is in power for too long. Of course, in Africa, we have some leaders that have been there for 20 and 30 and 40 years, and often you see that those countries get to a plateau and then they start having a dip. So that's a big challenge.
What though, Graham, as a leader yourself, would you look for in the future leadership of our countries, and what do you think they should be focusing on when we speak about, let's talk about brass tacks, the economy.
When people are self-serving rather than community serving, and they're at a point where it's all about own ego, own drive, etc., then that is where the red flag needs to go up. So, in a way, we know that there are certain people that have a caring heart, and their whole purpose is to serve. So, the word servant leadership sounds quite Christianese, but I think people that are out there in government, whether that be local, provincial, or national, need to have a situation where they get audited. Secondly, that they commit to be unashamedly ethical. That's something that I have a burden about. And thirdly, that people are sufficiently well educated that when they go in, it's not going on a populist ticket, but that they have the ability and skills to go and represent you and I.
Graham, we touched in that answer on something that is very, very relevant on everybody's tongue every day, and that is corruption. It is a word that is now being mentioned when you say government corruption, when you say leader corruption. You started a profound project called Unashamedly Ethical. Why?
So, again, I want to be careful to over-spiritualize this, but I ended up waking up with a dream. And in that dream, I understood that Cape Town and South Africa, that we would see a radical transformation from the southern tip of Africa that would impact Africa, and that through that Africa would impact the world. Now that sounds a bit crazy. Africa, this dark continent, to be a light to the world. But I want to say to you that I am absolutely convinced that God has a dynamic plan for this continent. So the same as we started this day of prayer from the Newland Stadium, which then rolled out over a 10-year period to 350 million people participating worldwide. Again, not my plan, God's plan. Not a great committee, but just being obedient. So that's the one aspect. The second thing is that when it comes to Africa and leadership in Africa, we need to be willing to lead by example, and we got to get to a point where corruption becomes a dirty word, and where we appreciate that one day it will come out, whether that be 3 years or 30 years, it shall come out and it will be an embarrassment. And how can we do business without having to do some kind of backhander and so forth?
Graham, you've been in business, let's call it, for 40 years odd. What is one thing that Graham Power still wants to achieve in his business life?
The purpose of the Power Group says to improve the quality of life in Africa through infrastructure development. And then, of course, we've got our values, which include ethics and professionalism, etc. But to improve the quality of life in Africa through infrastructure development. I would love to see, between IFA, ourselves, many others out there, to say, how can we challenge the leaders of Africa to get an infrastructure, a bulk main freeway infrastructure, rail infrastructure, that we can do business with each other. Think of the euro and the positives that it has done. And think of America, how people can move their things around. That must be that would be a dream, which at the moment seems light years away. It can be done if we put our heads together, and others out there.
So maybe one day I can say I sat with the Livingston of infrastructure for Africa, and that will be a dream come true. Graham, finally, what is your ultimate wish for this continent of Africa?
This is an amazing continent, and this continent in many ways has served the world. When we think about the slave trade, when we think about the kind of servant kind of leadership that we've seen come and go in this continent, I believe that Africa can feed itself. I believe that Africa has got the agricultural, the water resources in order to be the breadbasket for the world. Let's get our infrastructure right. Let's make sure that we are training people. Let's make sure that we don't get caught up in things like HIV, AIDS and other issues because of lack of decent medication and so forth. and we can and shall become a light to the world.
Graham Power, thank you for being a true African, and thank you
Amen.
for being on Neil on Africa.
My pleasure, Neil.
Thank you.